Welcome to the Daily Word on this Wednesday morning. It's so good to join you here online. This week, we are talking about the question, what is grace? Just a couple of days ago, we, your pastors, all spent Sunday afternoon, 3 hours of our Sunday afternoon in the sanctuary, confirming one outgoing sixth grader, they're about to start seventh grade, at a time. We decided to do a socially distanced, physically distanced, safe confirmation service for each family so that they could mark that milestone of faith life and continue to move forward in their faith journey. And it was a life-giving way to spend Sunday afternoon. It was a long day, but to hear over and over again one young person after another proclaiming their affirmation of faith and taking the vows of church membership, baptizing several of them, it gave us all a lot of hope and sustained us in our faith journey and in our vocation. We're excited to do that a couple of more times, so I invite you to be in prayer for those confirmands as they take on this faith journey together and as they become church members alongside all of us. It was good stuff. Something that I'm sure those confirmands spent a lot of time talking about in their classes over the last year is grace. As Methodist, we are all about grace, and we've broken that down into 3 different parts. You might be familiar with them. But when you just ask the question off the bat, what is grace? It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I have a friend who had a dog named Grace, which I think is a good theological statement, if there ever was one, to think about a dog or a pet for being a reminder of God's grace. Some might say that morning cup of coffee is a form of grace. I wouldn't disagree with them. But what is grace? We understand grace in 3 ways. There's prevenient grace, that grace that's unfolding in our lives before we're even aware of it. I think about that form of grace when I hear the words of Scripture that were shared just a Sunday or 2 ago in worship from Genesis 50:20, when Joseph is talking with his brothers about all that has happened in his life and how they meant that for harm, but God used it for good. I also think about prevenient grace earlier in the book of Genesis, when God is the Spirit hovering over the waters and creating a good place for human life to flourish that has rhythms for sustainability and meaning and goodness in the world. That's prevenient grace. And then we know about justifying grace, that grace that brings our lives into alignment with God and with God's will. That moment when we say yes to God's gift of salvation, and when we release those burdens that we've been carrying, the burden of sin, and give that to God for Christ to make right. I like in Matthew chapter 11 when Jesus talks about how the yoke is easy, the burden is light when we come unto Him. That's justifying grace. But the thing that makes us perhaps most distinctive as Wesleyans, and the form of grace that we spend most of our lives dwelling within, the one that I am most captivated by and like to talk about the most, is sanctifying grace. And we understand that as that grace that continues to unfold in our lives and make us more and more Christ-like with each day of our lives. We're called to do some work to make prevenient, to help sanctifying grace unfold in our lives. And those are those means of grace where we attend upon the ordinances of God, where we attend worship services and take communion and celebrate alongside others who are experiencing baptism, and pray and read Scripture. All of those things help sanctifying grace to unfold in our lives, but it is truly the work of God. John Wesley had a concept that he called Christian perfection, which is an intimidating set of words for us. None of us really like to think of ourselves as being perfect, and if you've ever been accused of thinking that you're perfect, you know what an unpleasant experience that can be. But Christian perfection is the idea that in our pursuit of Jesus and in the power of God's grace in our lives, we can become more and more Christ-like. We can operate more fully out of God's love than out of our own human fear or our sinfulness. It's the idea that day by day, the human part of ourselves is being pushed out of our lives while we become more fully a creature of God's grace, more fully leaning, depending on, proclaiming God's grace. Perhaps my favorite passage of Scripture in the Bible, although that's a hard thing to pin down, but one of my favorites, comes from 1 John, and in the 4th chapter, we hear an awful lot of talk about the love of God and love and God. And for me, this encapsulates what it means to live out of sanctifying grace, to pursue that form of life, that mode of operation, where we are driven by God's love for others and the world, even more than our fear. I invite you to hear these words from 1 John. It's chapter 4. God is love, and those who remain in love remain in God, and God remains in them. This is how love has been perfected in us, so that we can have confidence on the judgment day, because we are exactly the same as God is in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear expects punishment, the person who is afraid has not been made perfect in love. We love because God first loved us. Together, let's be in prayer about operating out of that love that God has for ourselves and for the world. We live in a time where it's easy to get caught up in our own fear, but I encourage you to band together with others, and together let's pursue that love of God, reminding ourselves that God has loved us first, and so we love others with that same love, reminding ourselves that we're not alone in this journey, and reminding ourselves that we can live grace-filled lives of meaning and purpose and goodness. Thanks for joining me. I hope you have a great Wednesday.